The African American Legends series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and journalism. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Roy Johnson, editor-at-large at Fortune magazine. Roy Johnson, you had a tremendous career in the journalism field, Sports Illustrated, Money, Fortune, etc. First of all, how did you get into this, and which of these experiences have you enjoyed the most?
Well, first of all, let me say that it is a pleasure and an honor to be here and be part of this discussion with you. And to answer your question, I always answered this way. I never got into journalism, but I've always felt that journalism was inside me. I was a fortunate young person who had a talent, and that was a talent to be able to write and communicate, and who discovered that talent early on. Sometimes not so much in a positive way. I was always writing notes, and my mother will always tell a story about how I scratched names in a headboard of our bed when I was about 4 years old. But learning to write and writing was something that I always found pleasurable. I was able to be the editor of my junior high paper and help create
Which was
that.
where? Where was
This
you?
was in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Tulsa.
And through high school and college, I just loved to be able to communicate. Now, what was interesting about all that was growing up in the early 60s, you know, I was one of those kids that got pretty good grades in school. And as you know, if you were a smart black kid at that time, you were supposed to become either a doctor or a lawyer. This journalism thing wasn't quite a respectable institution for someone who was supposed to have a real brain and could really contribute. So I minored in journalism because I never really felt or knew whether I could really make a living at it, but majored in political science and was going to become an attorney. Fortunately, I took the right direction, followed journalism right out of college, and have had so many experiences that have been valuable, meeting a lot of prominent people in sports and business and the arts. But if there's one real experience, it's just that everyday experience to be able to take a lot of information that I have at my disposal and communicate it in a way to readers or listeners that helps them understand or learn something that they didn't know before. And that's an experience that renews itself every day for me.
See, you were very fortunate in that you were able to bring one of your childhood dreams into reality. Much like myself, when I was a kid, I used to write sports pages. And I used to put out a little sports publication with my own drawings, etc. I also used to write stories about aviation and about flying, and fortunately I was able to become one of the Tuskegee Airmen. So able to live out that particular dream in reality. You now have interviewed almost every major sports personality, many major business personalities, etc. You've interviewed a lot of white athletes and a lot of black athletes. Which of those interviews are most memorable? Which of those people made the greatest impression on you in the time you were doing that work?
Well, what was interesting about my early career as a sports writer, there weren't a lot of black sports writers around the country.
And not a lot of black sportsmen in fields other than
Well, actually, there
basketball.
were quite a few now. We're talking about the 70s and 80s when the black athlete was starting to become more prominent, particularly in the NBA and even in football and baseball. But what often happened was that these athletes communicated better with the black sports writer than they did the white sports writer. So what I often found happening, and I always thought this was very funny, is the white sports writers would follow the black sports writers around and listen to us ask questions of the black athletes because they knew we were going to get better answers than the white athletes were going to, than the white sports writers were going to get. But intriguingly enough, some of the most interesting interviews that I've had have been with some of the white athletes, particularly someone like Martina Navratilova, who came to this country as an outsider, as a young child, and who endured many of the same discriminations and the experiences of African Americans as a foreigner to this country. And we had many extensive conversations about what it was like to come to America as a foreigner and try to gain the type of position and status where she was competing against Chris Evert, who was, you know, America's favorite tennis idol, and enduring some of the pain that she went through during that experience. We had some tremendous conversations about that. John McEnroe and I happened to go to college together, so I've seen his fiery temper for many years, and was able to sit with him many times and see that he was actually a relatively quiet person, in person. But of course, once he got out on the tennis court and that sort of twisted genius went to work, he became a different person. So whether the athlete was black or white, had many opportunities to have some tremendous discussions and some that I'll value for the rest of my life.
Now, sports writing has changed over the years. Many times the sports writer was the person who was getting training to go into politics and other editorial work. Some, like Damon Runyon and Bob Considine, became nationally known political columnists. But many sports writers were supposed to stick with the hits, runs, and errors, and the baskets and the touchdowns, etc. The new generation of sports writers seems to deal more with not only the dynamics of the game, but the intricate parts of the personalities of the figures. In a sense, I think the sports writers have had a lot to do, along with television, of making our sports heroes into international icons like Muhammad Ali and Michael Jordan and people of that type. As someone who really believes in journalism and has now moved in your career into other forms of reporting, what do you think brought that about? Do you think that is the development of the field, or the development of society, or the kind of individuals that went into the field?
Well, there's no question that sports is tremendously important to our lives as Americans. Sometimes to my own amazement. No matter where I go, people want to discuss some of my experiences as a sports writer as opposed to any other journalistic experiences I have. So clearly, athleticism and all that it embodies strikes a chord with most Americans. And to feed that, sports writers were put into a position of having to provide more and more information about our so-called heroes, about the people that we looked up to. We went through a period in the early 80s when more and more information was needed to fill that void. And I firmly believe that being a sports writer is one of the most difficult areas of journalism. Not only do you have to be able to cover the runs and hits and errors and baskets, as you say, but you also have to be part psychologist, part sociologist, because athletes come from so many different backgrounds, and those backgrounds have an impact on who they are as individuals. You also have to be able to cover business. I mean, sports business is one of the largest businesses in this country. A study was recently done that said if you put together in aggregate the combined revenues of all the sports entities in this country, sports would be the 11th largest industry in the United States. So it's clearly important from that standpoint. You have to have medical facilities. I remember the first time I heard of a medial collateral ligament and had no idea what that was. But now medicine is so much a part of athleticism that also has to be a part of your experience as a sports writer. So I think all of those things came into place, fell into place at the same time. Sports became very important to us as a society, and more colorful individuals became a part of the top echelon of all of our sports, and we just wanted to know more and more about them, and fortunately people like myself were in place to help relay that information to the public.
You know, some sociologists say that sports have replaced religion as the opiate of the masses. Sports, the opiate of the masses, keeping them in place and comfortable and so on. Is that a chicken-egg question?
I was going to say, I don't know if sports ever replaced religion. If sports was always there. It just wasn't on. We didn't have a 500-channel universe. We didn't have ESPN, ESPN News, CNN, SI. We didn't have so many outlets. You know, when I was growing up, we had 3 channels. I know I'm dating myself here. We only had 3 networks, and the only sports we saw was on the weekends. Maybe some NFL and maybe a game of the week in baseball, and rarely saw any basketball on national television. Today, you know, sports is a ubiquitous presence in our lives, and so to say that it has replaced religion as that status may be, you know, and being a religious person, it's hard to say. Maybe giving religion more credit than it is due, because we've always believed in our sports athletes, in our athletes. We've always believed in the goodness of sports, in the goodness of achieving and striving to achieve, and being able to learn from failure. In that sense, it's not very different from religion, in which we learn from the lessons that others provide us. It's just an opportunity to root and cheer as these experiences are happening, and take from those experiences lessons that hopefully we can build our own careers and build our own lives, so that we proceed towards trying to become champions in whatever it is we try to do.
Of course, religion is supposed to be free of all these worldly considerations like greed and profit and so on. Greed and profit are very much a part of the sport business in America.
greed and profit are a part of all business in
all
America.
business. So the question then is, you extol some of the values of sports, which I too believe in, being a former athlete, but to what extent are some of those values being distorted by the impact of business today?
I would say they're being distorted less by the impact of business than by the impact of humanity. Human beings are still the people who drive the sports industry, and human beings, as you know, are not perfect, and it's their imperfections that we hear more and more about these days, that perhaps there is more focus on those imperfections. But I firmly believe that you learn from those imperfections as well as you do the perfections. You don't always learn as much from the champions as you do the vanquished, how they handle that. Just more recently, an athlete like a John Daly, who has been trying and trying and trying to deal with his own addiction to narcotics, and so you can a lot of people can empathize with that, and so those who can root for a John Daly to try not so much to hit the ball 400 yards down the middle of the fairway, but to make it to the next day without drinking a beer. You know, that is what more people can identify with than his ability to hit the ball 400 yards. So I think that is really what is different about today, is that we're able to look at athletes as human beings, look at their imperfections. Some people judge them and make grand statements about whether they're good people or bad people based on those imperfections. But I try not to do that, because we all have imperfections. We all have to deal with them in our lives. And maybe their ability to deal with them is something that can help us in our own lives as much as their ability to hit the ball 440 feet over the center field fence.
Yeah, from an introspective point of view about the athletes themselves, I think many people would agree. But on the other hand, when you find large teams wanting to hold up cities to build a stadium with public money, and then threatening to leave, the old idea was, you know, the team was there for the community. And we found out later the team was there for the owner to make money. Maybe in particularly talking about baseball, maybe in the early days of some of the people like Wrigley and so on, they did want the team for the community. But they also wanted it for publicity. They wanted to see their names in play. Now we have people saying, well, look, if you don't build us a stadium, we're going to go to Nashville. And that's not a particularly positive view.
Yeah, I guess the notion of loyalty is something that used to be very much a part of sports, and is probably less so these days. That is where the business aspect of it perhaps intrudes upon that idealistic notion that many of us who have been followers of sports for years like to believe in. But the reality is that it's a business. It's a business not just for the owners, but for the players themselves. That's why you see so many players changing teams seemingly without reason other than following the dollar. In sports, it really has become about following the dollar, whether it's to a new city that will build a stadium for them, or to another city for an athlete. And I don't think that's going to change. I mean, that again is an unfortunate reality and a part of sports now, because it is a very large business.
One thing that's going to change is the antitrust exemption for baseball. That's going to change, because this really challenges that. The antitrust exemption was based on the fact it's a community activity and so on. Now it's clearly a business, and it's just really a matter of almost seconds before the antitrust exemption for baseball is eliminated.
That's what you would think. Baseball's got so many problems that the antitrust exemption, while many would believe would be important for them, is probably the least among them. I mean, they need to get a commissioner. They need to figure out a way to reinvent themselves so that they become relevant again. I don't know about you, but for me, baseball was the #1 sport when I was growing up. Today, I dare you to find too many young people in general, let alone young African Americans, who believe that baseball is the #1 sport in America. And that's an issue that baseball is going to have to deal with. And whether it's the antitrust exemption, finding a commissioner, or becoming relevant again for young people, baseball's got some serious problems that it has to deal with.
Yeah, like having the World Series in the afternoon sometimes, so the kids don't have to stay up to midnight.
The kids, what about those of us with 3-year-olds and 3-month-olds who can't stay up that late ourselves?
Now, you've written a lot and covered a lot about black athletes and studied them, as have I. And one of the questions that many of us think about is the extent to which athletics in the black community has become overemphasized, and how we can get a balance. What are some of your ideas on that?
Yeah, it really troubles me when I run not only into young people, but their parents who seem to have placed their entire future on an ability to put a ball in a basket, to throw a football, to run with a football, when the likelihood of them reaching the pinnacle of those professions, the NBA, the NFL, or Major League Baseball, the likelihood is so astronomically against it that they have a better chance of becoming a brain surgeon than becoming a professional athlete. That is a problem that I think that we all have to deal with first as parents. We have to let our kids enjoy sports, but not to make it such an imbalance that it is something that overshadows education and information and all of the other things that they need in order to be productive citizens. But as a community, we need to get out and let these young people know that there are other ways for them to attain the sort of riches that they seem to want to aspire to, that there are other opportunities, even some of them in sports, that will allow them to have fruitful careers for many years. And I think that's the obligation that I take personally. A lot of people that I know who are both in sports and out of sports try to go to the communities and go to these young people and say, look, here are some other opportunities. Here are other ways besides playing sports that you can take advantage of your skills and your interest and your intelligence in order to pursue long, lucrative careers.
What about the role of the athletes themselves, the black athletes themselves? Should they be doing more, or how can they do more to help get this message across? Because some of them seem to be very detached from the communities they came from.
You know, it's tough. So much is asked of our athletes these days that it's tough for anyone to say this is what the athlete should be doing. Certainly the athlete has a tremendous platform, and that young people do look up to them, and the media provides access to tremendous numbers of people. So using that platform to espouse the values of education, of hard work, of professionalism, and of other careers is something that I'd like to see more of them do, to embrace people around them, particularly people of color, as their agents, as their accountants, as their personal physicians, to help provide a little bit of a spotlight for them, to help young people see, hey, maybe there's some other opportunities that I can pursue that can help align me with the sports world. Those are some of the things that I think that they can do. And if each athlete just tried to surround himself with one or two major professionals of color, I think that would have a tremendous impact on our young people.
Why doesn't that happen?
Oh gosh, do we have enough time to really go into that? Some of it's just a lack of self-assurance about ourselves. Our young people don't see enough black doctors, black agents, black business people to maybe entrust their futures to someone. It's a lot easier when David Falk comes along as a representative of Michael Jordan, say, hey, I did this for MJ, I can do this for you too. When there are very few people of color who have been in that position, who can lay that kind of experience on the line and compete with a David Falk. But again, I think most of it goes back to our own inability to see ourselves in some of these vaulted positions and to be able to trust one another and say, hey, I want this person to sit down and represent me. I want this person to handle my finances because I believe in them. And that's something that just starts in our communities, and something that we have to try to educate and inspire each young person one by one to say, hey, there are people of color in our community who are doing great things and who deserve an opportunity to share in whatever riches and whatever successes that you may have, who can help take you to another level. We're just not there yet.
Well, the metaphor for African American, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, could well be expressed in Ralph Ellison's phrase, the invisible man. Now, one of the things that you're doing when your new publication, your new venture, the magazine Savoy, is to make that African American less invisible and more related to the rest of the world. Could you tell us a little about the magazine Savoy? First of all, the title, I know what it is, but many of the audience might not know, and what you expect to accomplish through the magazine.
Well, first of all, it's been a couple of years now since I began to feel that there was not, in the whole spectrum of thousands of magazines that are being published, a magazine that reflected my personal experience as an African American professional man who grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement and who has been able to take advantage of some of the opportunities presented by that movement, I didn't see myself reflected in the pages of magazines that were ostensibly supposed to reach out to me. And I won't name any publications, but I would go to the newsstand and not see myself, not see my friends, not see the accomplished people that I knew existed in the arts, in entertainment, in business, in finance, in all areas of our society. So I began to put together a business plan, look at the demographics, and essentially came up with the notion of creating a magazine called Savoy, The Life and Style of the African American Man, that would reflect the tremendous growth of affluence and influence among African American men in the United States and also around the world. Interestingly enough, this idea really began to emerge before the Million Man March, before Colin Powell was deemed a logical candidate for the Republican Party for the office of President of the United States, before Tiger Woods emerged as the preeminent athlete of the 21st century, more likely than not, and before a lot of things began to happen in America that began to show people that, hey, black men are doing it. They're doing it in business, they're doing it in the arts, and so my company, Time Incorporated, and I began to do research to look into the industry, to look into the opportunity, and are still trying to put together the right type of business plan, the right type of launch plan to help us to develop the right product and have it reach the right people in the most efficient manner. As you may or may not know, the publishing industry is very, very difficult in order to succeed. More than half of all magazines fail. And so we want to give ourselves the best opportunity to succeed at a time when it's very critical. So we're going to take our time. We think it's a very important publication to pursue. And once we come up with the right formula, hopefully it'll be on a newsstand near you and everyone else sometime in the near future.
There really are relatively few widely read African American magazines. Ebony, Black Enterprise, Essence Magazine, a couple of others. Yet in the African American community, they're very widely read. And as a result, get good advertising, because that's really what pays for a magazine. There are an increasing number of African American men and women who make good salaries. Many of them, like myself, read the other magazines. And sometimes we'll see an issue devoted to African Americans, sometimes about it. But it would appear that we would want to know about ourselves. Of course, I grew up in the days of segregation, and we got practically all of our information from the black press.
Right.
From the Pittsburgh Courier, from Chicago Defender, from the African American, from the Journal and
Oklahoma,
Guide.
it was the Oklahoma Eagle.
And my prototypes in sports writing were Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey, African American.
Absolutely.
So there is a background for this. I guess the real question in business is how do you put this together in a package that really sells?
Yeah, there's a tremendous background, and without the successes of Ebony, Essence, Black Enterprise, Savoy wouldn't even have gotten this far. So certainly credit goes to all the publications that have a long and distinguished history of showing that African Americans and people of color want to read, enjoy reading, will pay for the opportunity to read. And as our numbers grow, as we became more successful, as we began to earn more, I guess the latest figure is $469 billion in disposable income, those magazines not only grew themselves, but they also spawned other publications that were geared towards this market. Unfortunately, it has taken a long time for advertisers to realize the value of the African American consumer market. And if you talk to Ed Lewis and Clarence Smith at Essence, John Johnson at Johnson Publication, and Earl Graves at Black Enterprise, they will tell you that the struggle continues, that there are still numerous companies that don't recognize the African American consumer as a viable one, and therefore don't advertise in those publications. So, that's part of the struggle. That's part of trying to decide and to ascertain the viability of the marketplace. Are more companies ready to recognize the African American magazine reader as a viable consumer?
Now, given this emphasis on diversity in our society, where it says we have a very diverse society and we're all represented in everything, would it be a different situation if one of the major general publications were owned by an African American, and without focusing directly on African Americans, so that there was a great African American ambience in that? In other words, as diversity leads us to ownership, which is basically what African Americans don't have, would that change the playing field a little bit?
I mean, for the publication?
Yeah, right.
Well, I think it's certainly important. Important for any venture these days that seeks to capitalize upon the tremendous growth in the African American community, to demonstrate that with an ownership stake. I think that the core readership of any publication would recognize that as an important aspect of the business venture. But the most important aspect of it would be to put out a good publication, put out a publication that is reflective of our experience and creates a dialogue through which we can begin to address some of the images and questions that we often debate among ourselves. So yes, ownership is an important aspect of it. It's probably not the most critical aspect, but it's certainly one that, were it not there, would be a very, very sensitive issue to have to address.
Well, as African Americans face the 21st century, there are a lot of issues that we still are concerned with. We're concerned with affirmative action. We're concerned with upward mobility. We're concerned with getting a safety net for poor black folks. To what extent can a magazine like Savoy help to sensitize the achieving African Americans to those needs?
Well, what's so interesting about our experience today is that there are so many different kind of black folk. And I think sometimes we fall into the trap of having people to put us all in one net and say that this is what black America thinks. I don't agree with that anymore. I think it's impossible to determine what black America thinks because there are so many different black Americas these days. There are so many different points of view, all of which deserve to be aired and discussed, that the only way, we're going to let the rest of America know that we are more than one point of view. And the way we ourselves are going to get past some of the internal struggles that we have when we disagree is to have a forum, to have a place where we can come together and have the discussion, where it doesn't matter whether you are Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter whether you live in the suburbs or in the inner city, doesn't matter whether you live in the Pacific Northwest or in the southern parts of Florida. The point is to have a place where the issues are discussed, where the images are unveiled, and where you come away thinking, I want to know a little bit more about this subject, or I already learned a little bit more. And that's the value that a Savoy can bring.
Wish you a lot of good luck with the magazine Savoy. We've been talking with Roy Johnson, editor-at-large of Fortune magazine.